Welcome to episode 3 of Helping Forests Walk. I'm Connie Barlow, and today is June 24th, 2021. Earlier this month, I posted the first episode of this new series of mine. Just like my previous video series, Climate, Trees, and Legacy, the point of this series is advocating for assisted migration poleward of native trees. My previous video series benefited from my living on the road with my husband Michael Dowd for 18 years, so I had a variety of forested landscapes to study. Settled now in southern Michigan, I have a gentler way to talk about assisted migration. And that is with the term that Robin Wall Kimmerer coined, helping forests walk. Here's how Robin spoke of it in an interview with the UK newspaper The Guardian just last week. Even as she notices the alarming fact that bloom times are arriving ever earlier, she is also increasingly aware of the natural movement of plants. Quote, "We've fragmented the planet in such a way that their natural migration routes are broken up. So it's our responsibility now to assist that migration, to essentially help forests to walk. We have to help them get to where they need to go. Will we be here to witness a new world, the one that she believes will be regenerated for us by the plants?" She hesitates and then says, "I have less faith in that." To my mind, helping forests walk is the right thing to do during this time of rapidly changing climate. It's the right thing to do no matter what the ultimate outcome for our own species. As Robin says in the interview, the plant world will continue. She says, "I have faith in photosynthesis. I am, of course, complicit in the dangerous warming of the planet, but I can redeem myself in part by helping forests walk." This third episode is titled Thinking Like a Yew, and I mentioned in episode 1, the graveyard scene, that I would make a video featuring yew. One of the episodes that I'll surely be doing has to do with this genus. Genus Taxus. This is the yew family, and take a look at how huge this tree is here. This happens to be the European yew. This is the kind of yew that was planted in cemeteries, and in fact, right outside the house we're staying in now in Ypsilanti. This is the kind, it's the European yew, Taxus plicata. This also is Taxus plicata, horticulturally the European yew. And as you can see, this one is browsed only by us humans. There are no deer here in this old neighborhood of Ypsilanti, Michigan, even though it's only a half mile from the cemetery. With all the video segments I've taken throughout North America, this video is going to be a little over an hour long, and I'll put lessons at the end of what I've discerned natural history skills of where the likely best places to plant Taxus species are. So this video is really just for tree nerds. It's too long for anyone else. But here you might be able to discover for yourself the natural history aspects of what plant associates, what microclimates, what topographies are best for native yews here in North America, and also I hope in Europe and China as well. Here are the maps of our two widespread species of native yews in North America. Pacific Yew is in the west and Canadian Yew in the east. Notice that just by looking at these maps, you can tell that habitats favored by yew are cool and moist. Pacific Yew is a mountain species in the coast ranges of mountains in the west and the northern Rockies. Canadian yew lacks the strong mountainous topography of the western North America, but nonetheless it is still able to find good habitat in ravines and north-facing slopes. And as you will see, this species is unique in staying short enough to hide beneath a blanket of snow, and so it inhabits landscapes far northward in Canada. For both of these species, what you see on the maps is it looks like they got a lot of habitat, but that's actually very wrong. In all places, yew, Pacific yew, and Canadian yew are disjunct. That means they have small, disparate populations. Here, for example, is a map just of the California section of Pacific yew. And this, where you see the spots, are the little populations, probably a lot smaller than those spots themselves. They're in pockets. No population is really extensive. And so that's where the question comes in terms of how will those disparate populations survive during climate change. We'll begin with Pacific yew, Taxus brevifolia. We'll be taking a look at 3 spots in the Pacific Northwest of the USA. We won't be going up into Canada at all, and we won't be going down into California. The first place will be in the east side of the very wet zone of the Cascades of Oregon. Next, we'll go up to the Olympic Peninsula, northwestern Washington, and then we'll head east of Seattle to the very east side of the Cascade Range of mountains. Now, all 3 of those sites have very high topography. I'll be spending the most time in the 3rd site, that is east of Seattle, the east side of the Cascades. I encourage professional researchers on yews here in North America and other continents to go to the U.S. Department of Agriculture website on Taxus brevifolia. It's got many, many sections to it, and I'm just going to show a few here. In the successional status section, it reads, Pacific yew is present in many climax or near climax communities of the Pacific Northwest and northern Rocky Mountains. It is a particularly common component of old-growth Grand Fir, Western Red Cedar, and Douglas-fir Western Hemlock communities. Pacific yew increases in cover up to a stand age of at least 500 years in northwestern old-growth Douglas-fir forests, which are characterized by long fire-free intervals. This fire-sensitive species is absent from areas characterized by high fire frequencies. Native Americans traditionally used Pacific yew for constructing harpoons, spear handles, eating utensils, and other things. And I might mention it's also called bow wood. It was excellent for making bows. Oregon is our first site to visit. Sahalie and Cascade Falls are public recreational areas along the McKenzie Pass, Santiam Pass area of the West Cascades National Scenic Byways. This is a deep gorge section of the McKenzie River and will be in the vicinity of Sahalie Falls. This is the Pacific yew in an old-growth conifer forest here in western Oregon. And I stopped here because it's really easy for me to see the distinction between a yew needle and right here, this is a western hemlock. The hemlock always has 2 layers, and the inner layer on a branchlet is much shorter than the outer layer. They're both, very flexible and easy to touch, but it's just much easier to see that. Now, this is a baby hemlock, but behind me, this yew, as you can see looking down into that area, it's multi-stem, and this could be older than me, and yet it's this small. It's an understory tree. It never gets very big. And when I'm in redwood country that also has Pacific Yew, the way I tell the difference, because they sure look the same when they're young, is if I pull off a needle of the yew, it comes absolutely clean with just its little stem on the end. And if I do that to a redwood, it has a thread of green thread of bark holding on to the end. And that's the only way I can tell the difference when they're this young. I just walked a little further. This is the only young Pacific Yew I've seen along the trail here. Let me do a close-up. And it tends to have pointier, see the little points on the ends of the needles? There tend to be little points. And you don't have that double row, all the needles coming flat out, just flat out, not sticking up. The hemlocks are round.
Western Red Cedar to the right is the only canopy tree other than western hemlock whose young can grow in the dense shade where the rare Pacific Yew can grow without too much competition. And that is Pacific Yew, about as tall as it gets here, right next to the river on the left. Both cedar in the back that my husband Michael is hugging and hemlock toward the front can grow gigantic in the Pacific Northwest. Here's a yew branch in front of a cedar, genus Tsuga, in western Washington. This is the Olympic Peninsula site that we'll go to next. Now back to the falls site of the McKenzie River Gorge. Here's my husband again, and he's hugging Douglas-fir, genus Pseudotsuga. And again, this is at the falls. This is on the walkway going down to the falls. Now this requires full sun throughout its life, so we know that it got started maybe after this walkway was put in and a sunlight gap was created. They grow very fast. The sound of the waterfall again as we go back and we take a look at another scraggly yew growing very close to the river there, but full shade. Continuing over, we got another scrawny looking yew in there. Now we see the river. This is a multi-stemmed yew, very near the river, reaching up. This is about as tall as they get, and again, it's because it had a place to send a leader up into the sky. Here you can see it reaching out over toward the Western Red Cedar, genus Tsuga.
Pacific Yew. Versus over here, hemlock.
Western Red Cedar has reddish, stringy bark when mature. We've just finished the first of our 3 sites for Pacific Yew. Now we go up to the Olympic Peninsula of western Washington state. And here's a view. This is the context of the kind of forest we're in. The Olympic Mountains are here, and this is a very, very wet portion of Washington State. It's a rainforest. You can see a lot of moss on the branches of these trees near the ravine. That's where we'll be going. This is a Pacific Yew. Very different from hemlock. Big leaf maple. But here you can see it's actually, there's the central stem of it right there. And right over to the left here is a little hemlock, about the same size, but here in this forest they also get huge, and you can see the distinction in the needle structure. Not nearly as flat, and also they're completely round on the edges. So this is the hemlock. And here's the massive forest that we're in with the great Douglas-fir. Also a lot of cedar down there. And this is the biggest Pacific Yew I've seen. We're almost out of the trail here. I just hadn't noticed it before. We saw this from about 30 feet away. But this is quite a large stem here. It's getting pretty good sun given the tree falls around here. Take a look up. Just so distinctive, very, very different from a hemlock. Understory trees, yew and torreya, have no problem with having something fall on them, as this one has, and then just keep growing. Here, I'm going to move down here, and you can see it would have been these logs here, and then someone sawed them. But this is what is blocking the stem, or rather the lower branch, and you can see it's just sort of filling out and creating little branchlets all along the stem, whereas what's more normal is for a stem that hasn't been pushed over to just go outward and then make most of its leaflets out where it can actually gather some sun, where it's not shaded by its own leaves in there. Ah, thank you, Pacific Yew. So, we finished the first two sites, Oregon and the Olympic Peninsula, and now we're moving to the third and final site for Pacific Yew. This is the east side of the Cascades, and here's another view of the vegetation. Here's a look at the gorge that we're going to be in. This is the drainage of Icycle Creek, heading out of the east side of the Cascades, and here we're looking west into the heart of the Cascades. We're going to be along a trail on both sides of the river there. The first will be on the north-facing slope. North-facing slope has a tendency to have the coolest, shadiest loving plants. But this is so deep in the canyon that even when we cross over to the south-facing side, that's on the right-hand side of this picture here, very near the river, it's still very cool and moist. Moist enough for Pacific Yew. It's growing in the total dark, which is where you usually find them. Multiple kind of old stem here, but here's where the new top is coming out. And well, first I'll show what's behind it. Really huge. I don't know what that tree is, but we are in there's a cedar swamp. We're in a cedar swamp. We're along Icycle Creek, far up, kind of up the canyon. This is along the loop trail here, and this is the flat area that has moisture coming down into it. You can see this tree narrowly missed being taken down by the fall of a spruce. A lot of spruce down here right now. The bark is certainly diagnostic here. Flakes off into smooth. Oh, whoa, it's coming out right from underneath that giant log there, so the log did push it over. That is a very old stem, multi-stem, for a Pacific Yew. Right along this little creek is the biggest spruce I've seen thus far. This is an Engelmann Spruce. So this creek is keeping it well watered, cool, and as you would expect, most of the trees here are the water-loving Western Red Cedar, which you will not find up on the mountain slopes. But spruce is what would dominate up at the highest levels on the mountains where they're still able to survive. So here's just a sense of how big this trunk is. So this would be an Engelmann. And it's still alive. I'll go up here. You can't see very far, but there are spruce needles up there. Just came from back on that trail there. You can see dying spruce bark right there, but look what's coming in after this tree fall area. See all the sun, and look at right there, the baby spruces coming in. What's remarkable is how blue they are. They've got to be Engelmanns because there are no blue spruce here yet. Here's a spruce right along the trail about 20 feet tall, and it's rare to get a chance to see a branch like this. They're usually quite high up. Get a little closer here. And it's just right next to a young Grand Fir. And here you see the new growth is that light green, and the older growth, dark green, glossy. Oh, and there's the stem of it when they're young, like many firs, true firs, when they're young. Smooth looking bark. In contrast, from a distance, I'll show it at a distance, I thought this might be a Pacific Yew. Nope, look at the double size there. This is a Grand Fir, and also from the bark there. This is a Grand Fir that is growing in pretty much deep shade, getting a little bit of sun up there. I'll show it at a distance. Okay, I'm standing on the trail looking back at it, and you can see why I decided I had to go up close and take a look at this. When Grand Fir has to struggle in shade, it just doesn't produce It doesn't produce the really big, glossy green leaves that you see where it has sun. A short ways down the trail, here's the big, glossy, flat, big green needles, soft needles of a Grand Fir when it gets lots of sun. Would never mistake this at a distance for a Pacific Yew. Here's a baby Grand Fir, and here's a trillium. Here is a beautiful little garden right along the trail on an old stump. A couple trilliums there with the 3 leaves on the left. Baby Grand Fir. Some Oregon grape, including some berries forming on them. And as we look back here, this is a twin flower. This lush ground cover was found only on the shaded north-facing slope of the gorge. Devil's Club. There's one starting to bloom in the center. Or finished blooming. Those might be the berries. Beautiful at a distance. Very thorny. And we've got big cedars in this area. So this kind of bark right here, that turns out to be a Grand Fir because it's got some branches low enough so I can tell. And as we scoot around, this is a Douglas-fir here. Wow. And here's some glorious dwarf dogwood. Genus Cornus, just like the dogwood trees, but this is the low-growing form. And look, we've got a couple baby Grand Firs. And here's Western Red Cedar, genus Tsuga, right next to it. Standing on the trail, and yet another instance of a Grand Fir, healthy, light green in the sun, next to a branch of a Pacific Yew emanating from that thick area in there. And then as we go along, right here we have another instance, and you can see we're right on the trail here, of a Grand Fir here on the left, and right alongside it, a Pacific Yew. Western White Pine on the Icycle Creek Loop Trail, east side of the Cascades by Wenatchee. Just absolutely gorgeous bark. I love the bark of white pines. And for scale, I've got a husband in here. Oh, and right next to it there, enveloping it, is a Grand Fir. Lodgepole Pine. Needles come in groups of 2. They're kind of thick. And here's the bark that it comes from. Right there. And here we are on the edge of Icycle Creek. I don't want to ignore the Ponderosa Pine right along the trail here. So here's looking up at this beauty. In one area on the south-facing slope, the trail went pretty high above the gorge, and we got into much drier country. Here on the left is a Douglas-fir, a big Douglas-fir, and to the right, Ponderosa Pine, which can grow in even drier zones than the Douglas-fir. I'm showing these pictures because that's wolf lichen. It's a kind of lichen, not a moss, on the Douglas-fir. And in this next picture, on the Ponderosa Pine, that's wolf lichen again. And then again, with a view of the Cascade Mountains. You won't find any wolf lichen down in the gorge itself, and certainly not around where Pacific Yew grows. Let's take a quick turn back to site number 2, Olympic Peninsula. Here you can see a lot of lichen growing in the wintertime when the big leaf maples have lost their leaves, so that this is the time that they get sun. Here's a close-up of some other kinds of lichen, and you can see the deciduous leaves fallen of big leaf maple. And all the moss growing on these trunks. Now we return to Icycle Creek for the last part of our Pacific Yew journey. This is a much bigger, older Pacific Yew. Look at that smooth purple bark, diagnostic. And also its growth form here. Look at its stem coming out in this curvy position here, curving over away from the much younger tree growing next to it, and just putting out a lot of lateral branches. The thing I notice about it that's interesting is leaves, very obvious, but also I'm noticing that they tend to come out of, the stems are green where they come out of, and they pull off perfectly, whereas the Grand Fir, I think, comes out of stems that are brown, even their newer growth here. Here's older growth in here. Pacific Yew. This looks like a single stem coming out. Oh, this is going to be really useful here. I just found I'm standing next to a very small Grand Fir here. And first I'm just trying to go up here and show the height right in the middle of the camera there. A lot of leaning. But what you see right here is a young spruce. Very, very characteristic. They point to, at such an acute angle here that you can go like this. They don't hurt. It's not like blue spruce. Blue spruce will really hurt if you do that. But look at this. We got a baby Grand Fir right here. And here you can see kind of the glossiness and the kind of light greenish. Look how glossy that is. And the needles are two different sizes. They go straight out, just like the Pacific Yew, but there's two different sizes of needles in there. See that? And they're round. Pacific Yew, moving right over here. This is the Pacific Yew. These are actually pointy, little pointy needles in here. Wonderful place. Here we can see all three. There we got spruce at the top, Grand Fir to the left, and Pacific Yew right below. Here's a baby white pine right next to a baby Grand Fir. And I'm not sure why it was called white, but it could have something to do with the fact that when you turn the needles over, they've got white stripes on it. Having grown up in Michigan, I'm very familiar with white pine, but the eastern white pine, which has longer needles, and it's a very, very tall, huge, dominant tree when given an opportunity to grow in Michigan. Okay, just came from this trail, and I looked over here and I said, this is weird. And what it is that there's a tree
that fell on top of a Pacific Yew. Everything you see around here are the branches of Pacific Yew that are no longer exactly quite flat on the branchlets here because they got so much sun, but they are still the very pointy things that they have. So this is a Pacific Yew. Look at, it's been growing branches up. You see them starting to go up from a variety of places here, way back into there, and I'm going to go look and see where the original trunk is now. Okay, this is about as exciting as it gets. Look at this. It's a kind of purplish stem, but what you got coming out of here, right here, these you'll never find coming out of a stem like this on any of the canopy trees. This is a Pacific Yew. Okay, starting back from that same little stem, just look at how lush this is. It's got all this horizontal growth opportunities now that it's been pushed down. Here you can see leaning out several of these stems. An original place where they seem to all come out of is, and actually there, I think that comes out of another branch that was pushed over at an earlier time. Another one comes out here. Look at how happy it is here. My gosh, this is all new growth. New growth here. And yeah, look at how it just loves this horizontal. And it's right next to here, a big western, oh my gosh, look at that. It continues back there. We're going to go check that out. Oh my gosh, all of this here. That's not Grand Fir. I think this is all, see all those stems rising from the base? I think that's all Pacific Yew. This clonal area, oh my gosh, it could be centuries old. I'm going to go keep exploring. I'll see if I can find the biggest, thickest trunk area emanating from the ground. Oh my gosh, look at that. There's a double stem coming out of there, and I can't tell whether what it's coming out from this side used to be a giant yew or whether it's just coming out of the edge. I'll go over there and take a look. But oh my gosh, look at this. So it was growing, both of these stems, but look what happened here. Another tree fall happened that curved over, and here's the tree that fell on it. And there's more back there. And look at, anytime you see a double stem coming out like that, okay, and like that, you know that that's Pacific Yew. It's not one of the canopy trees. Let's keep exploring. Okay, I looked behind there. This is that same double stem little area I was looking at. Look at, there's a much older tree fall right there. Right there, you can see that purple smooth stem. That also is coming out from underneath. So there was another branch long, long ago that was pushed over by this near rotting tree fall here. It's Pacific Yew everywhere. There, look at that. Coming out from in that mess there. And here's another one right straight in front. Surely it would have been coming from a branch and then grew up, and now there's dirt around it. And then there's this whole area here. Wow. Oh yeah, look at this. Look at this. There's that tree fall right there. It's already turning into dirt, and what would have been a larger stem of the yew is buried under there, and look at all these coming out. Smooth purplish bark leaning, and again, look at, there would have been another one that's now under the dirt here, coming out here. Very unlikely that this was from seed. It's probably all just from centuries worth of branches being fallen on and growing. So this looks about the edge as far as they go, right out to here. I still have to explore, follow up this fallen log here, and look at that. There's a whole lot more back there. Going to keep exploring.
Yet again, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service, has some really useful information explaining what I've just seen. Vegetative regeneration. Branches and stems of Pacific Yew commonly root when in contact with the soil. Plants are generally unharmed after being flattened by large conifers during canopy breakup. Crushed yews often form a series of layered branches that give rise to numerous individual plants. Regeneration of Pacific Yew is favored by falling debris. Layering enables Pacific Yew to quickly expand into gaps created as senescent conifers fall. Sprouts generally develop from cut or broken stumps. Epicormic branching is also common. Now this is really interesting. In parts of the northern Rocky Mountains, this short tree, Pacific Yew, expresses climax sociological dominance over tall conifers, such as Grand Fir. This situation differs from the classical pattern in which progressively taller taxa gradually assume dominance over shorter forms. The successional role of Pacific Yew in these forests has been subject to a number of interpretations. However, Pacific Yew is generally considered the climax dominant because, in the absence of disturbance, it successfully replaces itself to the near exclusion of tall conifers. And what they mean by that, in the absence of fire. But it's all these conifers, it might be every century or every 2 centuries, another conifer falls on it, and boom, it's able to spread vegetatively. Let's continue. Again, back at Icycle Creek.
Okay, just came from back there. That's Michael's knees by that big cedar. Here's Pacific Yew in front here, going quite high up. What's interesting at this spot, here you can see it, a branch coming out between those trunks here, Pacific Yew. Here's another one coming out from behind here. But what we come to is the very edge of the pointy-tipped Pacific Yew branches. And what we meet right over here is Grand Fir. And you see the Grand Fir is coming up from a absolutely straight stem that goes up and is going to head into the canopy. But here it meets. Here's the two meeting right here. Grand Fir, by my thumb, rounded, variable size, and then the pointier Pacific Yew. Oh, what a find. Just one look back at what we've got. All Pacific Yew hanging around here. Thick Pacific Yew in there with a little spruce or something in between. And we'll head back to the trail. 50 feet down the trail, here's another Pacific Yew. Everything you see here is a Pacific Yew stretching out horizontally that has benefited over the years from a number of tree falls and is happy to get sun whenever it can, but it sure doesn't want anything else to be growing up in here. Pacific Yew. All that in there, that's Pacific Yew. And back down to the trail. One more thing, I figured since we've got some sun here, yew will only reproduce if it's got some sun on branches, and so I haven't seen any sign of reproduction or anything else, but they always do it on the underneath. And look what we have here. We have some old spent pollen cones from this yew. So this means that it is a, nothing here, but it's a male. They come in male and female. All right, there's a trail up in there, and I just had to come over again. This is very close to where I was on the other side. Look at this. Everything you see in the foreground here is Pacific Yew. Wonderful shrub. There's a big tree fall back there. But what I can see, oh, look at this. Here's another example of what happens. Look at this. What's going to happen through time is that there's going to be some little roots that go down in there, and that log's going to rot, and that's going to turn into another, and it'll keep stretching out. But what I find here, this is a really good example of the trunks coming out of the bottom here. Got another place here where the biggest ones are, ooh, there's an even bigger one back there. Yeah, this good view of it. And I think there's some more in there, but I don't need to go any farther. But look how far this stretches out with its purplish horizontal branches. And continuing right here, heading up. Okay, this stem I already showed is probably the biggest one, and what I'm stopping for here is look at all the little branchlets coming directly out of this older horizontal stem. Diagnostic. None of the other conifers will do that. And here's a little peek into what's also back there. All right, that's it. I'm going to stop filming Pacific Yew. There's just so many of them. This is awesome.
Heading over to the east side of North America, we'll conclude this video with short sections on our two yew species native to eastern North America: Florida yew and Canadian yew. And I'm intentionally starting with a slide of what North America looked like about 13,000 years ago. You see that Pacific yew was not nearly as greatly affected by continental glaciation as our eastern yews were. And how do we know that those two yews in the east are actually separate species, especially given how closely related all Taxus species are in the world? Well, there's several hundred miles of yew-less territory between them. But even more striking is that only the Florida yew will grow somewhat tall. The Canadian yew, in contrast, while far more widespread, will reach, at most, half my height. But it's fabulously clonal, horizontally. Let's get started with Florida yew. Taxus floridana, the Florida yew, is a species of yew endemic to a small area of under 10 kilometers squared on the eastern side of the Apalachicola River in mesophytic forests of northern Florida at altitudes of 15 to 40 meters above sea level. It is listed as critically endangered. It is protected in reserves at the Torreya State Park and at the Nature Conservancy's Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. It has legal protection under the United States and Florida endangered species laws. In this photo of Florida yew I took back in 2004 during a visit to Torreya State Park, you can see a very warm adapted plant growing in the surrounds. It's a palm, needle palm, sole member of genus Rhipidophyllum. Taxus floridana is quite obviously a glacial relic. It is found today only in a small area of North Florida, along the east side of one of the big rivers draining the Appalachian Mountains southward. I visited this site several times, beginning in the late 1990s, but I've always focused on another endangered glacial relic during those visits, Florida Torreya, Torreya taxifolia. It's a close relative of yews, but it's now suffering from diseases because it really needs to head back north, which I've been helping it do in our citizens group, Torreya Guardians, which has been undertaking assisted migration poleward of this tree since about 2004 as a necessary first step in helping forests walk. To learn more about Torreya Guardians, Google torreyaguardians.org. We have an extensive website featuring our assisted migration projects northward. And I can't resist showing a baby photo here from a seed I planted in the southern Appalachians. This is a fully rewilded specimen of an endangered species. And what we've learned along the way is that our native evergreen fern, genus Polysticum, is a fine indicator of the soil type, climate, moisture, and forest canopy conditions where this ancient member of the Taxaceae family can thrive without any further human assistance. We just need to help it walk there. Now, back to Florida yew. Here's an old Florida yew. Look at all the growth coming out of the base. Here's the old stem. And you can see there's also some branchlets coming out there as well. Here's where the main part of it is leaning and then trying to get some sun. Here's the surroundings here. Not far from a couple of Torreyas. Let's take a close look. See if there's any buds out here that might produce. I don't see any. This looks like there's some potential here. This is looking at the underside of one of the branchlets that gets the most sun, and looks to me like maybe that's one there, right in the center. Maybe some more along there underneath. Florida yew. So we move down the stem here, and that one there, that upright, that's also part of the same system. The Florida yew. All right, here I found on some of the branchlets obvious buds. I don't know if that's the pollen buds for next year or whether those will actually become the red yew fruits. The two stems in the middle are Florida yew. And here you can see the effects of deer browsing the lower foliage. Torreya State Park is a state park, so it's difficult to control deer from overpopulating in a state park, where deer have no predators, no cougars, and no human hunters. However, and this applies to all yews in the world, whether wild or horticultural, Grazing animals, particularly cattle and horses, are also sometimes found dead near yew trees after eating the leaves, though deer are able to break down the poisons and will eat yew foliage freely. In the wild, deer browsing of yews is often so extensive that wild yew trees are commonly restricted to cliffs and other steep slopes inaccessible to deer. As an example, here's me a few weeks ago pointing to the high deer browsing of century-old horticultural yews from Europe planted in this cemetery near where I live in southern Michigan. Here's another example of yews in that same cemetery, browsed high by winter-hungry deer. So now we turn to the final set of videos I've taken of our native yew in eastern North America. I've visited 2 places with wild Canada yew, northern Michigan and the border of New York and Massachusetts. I've also visited a botanical garden in Nova Scotia. And see that farthest south green dot in southern Virginia? A friend sent me a photograph of wild yew growing in that place too. Truly a glacial relic. We'll start with the small horticultural planting in Nova Scotia, Canada. It's on the grounds of Acadia University. Notice that the name the Canadians use for this yew is ground hemlock. Ground hemlock is a good name for this short, shrubby type of wild yew, not only because its leaves look similar to our wild eastern hemlock, but also because the 2 species overlap a lot in their native ranges. Take a look at this pair of maps. Keeping the map of eastern hemlock on the right, I'll put western hemlock on the left. Notice that both of these evergreen conifers range pretty far to the north. And recall Pacific Yew? There's a huge overlap in ranges there, although the hemlock tree goes far into coastal Alaska, while Pacific Yew barely reaches the southernmost tip of coastal Alaska. Okay, back to our pair of eastern species, Canadian yew and eastern hemlock. Next up will be a deep and rugged ravine with waterfalls on the border of New York State and Massachusetts. This is Abies Falls State Park. Here's the falls with a hemlock in the foreground and another view of the falls, this time with yellow birch in the foreground. Now here's the video I took of this site. A clone of Canada yew. This is only the second place I've ever noticed it. I'd thought these were just baby hemlocks, but they're not. I'll show a close-up of the leaf. This is Canada yew. Right down there, Abies Falls is in that direction.
And again, you see the clonal features here. Let's go in close on some of this.
Hemlock trees, both eastern and western species, do very well in deep ravines, and they are adept at sending roots downward off the top of rocks and also downed logs. The next location is the southernmost outpost of Canadian Yew in Virginia. I have just one photo that was taken there. It is on a very steep slope, so steep that deer cannot forage on the flowers that you see there in the photo. My guess is that the yew shrubs are in the far upper right. But this part of the Appalachian Mountains is rather gentle. The cliff is probably the darkest spot that you can see in this picture, labeled Natural Tunnel State Park. It's pretty clear that if humans don't get involved in helping seeds or rooted branchlets of this relict move, the destination of this isolated population is certain extinction. The final site where I visited wild Canadian yew was on the Keweenaw Peninsula of northern Michigan. This was mid-September 2015. Now, this is the most extensive clone of Canadian yew found just on one low side of a sloping ravine. What's unusual here is that the current overstory is entirely northern hardwoods, mostly red oak and sugar maple, with some yellow birch. However, this area was extensively logged, so one cannot know whether hemlocks and white cedar trees, that is, genus Tsuga, the relative of the Western Red Cedar out west, genus Tsuga, might have been the original canopy when you finally returned this far north after the glaciers receded. Also unusual, as you'll see in the video, is that deer just don't live in the area. The winter snow volume generated by Lake Superior is so immense that only moose, Alces gigas, have long enough legs to live here. As well, you can count on this snow to keep the yews safely covered, and therefore protected from bitterly cold air, too.
Boy, this is a beautiful area. This whole ravine is filled with it. This one breaks and then it starts again. It could very definitely be another genotype, but it's also male. To not.
So here's a close-up right here of the edge of where, as far as the yew is willing to head uphill, probably drought conditions.
Yeah. Clearly it doesn't get to the top. I mean, it kind of drops off, and then you've got this, you got more of the cove effect here.
Yes, the cove effect.
Yeah, and it's just going right along the rim here.
Going right along the rim. So here we have a mixture of sugar maple and a few red maples in here. This would be northern
hardwoods. Northern hardwoods, beech, birch, but there's no beech here.
And right in front there is a yellow birch, and you can see it's surrounded by this clone.
That's right. And there's a sugar maple.
Yeah, this is nice. You can even see the golden, the golden aspect here. I'm going to make the camera go up so that people can see how shaded it is in here.
Yeah, no, it's
that
moist and shaded.
Yeah, and so this
and cool.
And the reason that this is the first time I've ever seen a Canadian yew is that you get so much snow here that the deer can't really live here. And so everywhere I've been here on the Keweenaw, the understory is fabulous.
This is hawthorn bean.
Okay.
Australia.
But again, right down below here, right here is where the baby maples come in, and that's as far upslope as the Taxus canadensis is willing to come. Sure looks healthy to me. Could this be like 1,000 years old, this individual here?
Why? It could be. You know, all of these birches in here would suggest that this was really an open canopy, an open place at one time, and the oaks. They would not get to the overstory like that without a lot more light. But it must have been moderate levels because you got a mixture of sugar maples in the canopy along with birches and red oak. So it's a mixed, it must have been disturbed, but having enough shade so that these maples survived as well and went to the overstory.
Yeah.
But this is beautiful. I mean, these oaks.
That's the end of the video component of this natural history investigation of wild yews, genus Taxus, in the USA and Canada. Now it's time for me to offer some interpretations. What lessons do I glean from working on and watching these videos again? How am I learning to think like a yew? If I were a yew, what instructions would I be offering to humans for helping me walk in sync with climate change? Well, here I'll close by offering 7 lessons. First, look for cool, dark, and moist places, but make sure they're well drained. Putting yews on slopes is a pretty solid way to ensure that their roots won't get waterlogged. Now, what kind of slopes? Well, the slope of a ravine, especially deep and dark down in a ravine, or on the north side of a mountain. 3, fires. Find a place where naturally there just aren't any fires, or they've been rare over the course of centuries. That'll be easier to do in the eastern United States, where it's not as fire prone. We don't have as many pines. But out west, especially in the Rockies, you're going to have to really choose the bottom of canyons, probably, to stay away from fire zones. 4, look for places where deer rarely venture into the site because of, could be the density of the forest. Deer are basically edge species, and they will come into forests, but they're not going to be inhabiting them unless there are edges. And so that means woodlots where there's farms around probably aren't going to be good places. The deer are just going to be eating the yew like deer candy. Another way is if you have a really steep slope. Now, deer can go on steep slopes, as it turns out, but if you can get on a really steep slope that maybe the deer won't really want to stop on, then you can put yew there. Another possibility for where deer rarely venture into is anywhere where there's big carnivores, and that makes ravines dangerous. Now, this is true. This is what we have out west. There are mountain lions in most of the places out west where you're going to be finding wild yew populations, and they're in the Rockies too, but they are not in the east, and especially because the eastern United States and Canada don't have the mountain-type slopes. It's really, really going to be important to get some cougars back there. And up in Canada, there may be wolves already. And certainly any ravine that contains loud, rushing water, like rapids or waterfalls, really puts deer on edge because they can't hear the footfalls of an approaching predator. Those sites would be best of all. So what that means is if you want to help the yews, then rewild the carnivores. That will make the ravines deer-free. 5th lesson is look for places where the slope itself and the winds encourage periodic tree falls. Remember the Icycle Creek site where the yew might have been just 1 or 2 actual genotypes there, but over the course of likely centuries, they had spread and basically started shading out any seedlings of canopy trees coming in, because whenever a canopy tree fell onto them, they didn't break. They just bent right over and kept going horizontally. So look for those kind of slopes and wind conditions, and that's where it will be good over the long term to plant yews. 6, help the isolated relict populations first. Now that's pretty obvious. They're already called glacial relics, the furthest south ones, and that probably means virtually every yew in California needs to have its seeds or its rooted branchlets moved northward. Finally, seek out places that have Tsuga. That's the genus of what we call hemlocks, eastern hemlock and western hemlock here in the Americas. Genus Tsuga and genus Tsuga. Those are what we call the white and the red cedars, genus Tsuga. Seek out places where they are the canopies. They are their evergreen shading. They both can grow within the shade of dense shade in ravines and so forth. But the fascinating thing is that while we have genus Tsuga and Tsuga in both the western area and the eastern area of North America, especially where the deer aren't overpopulated, because the deer will eat a lot of Tsuga. But where we have Tsuga and Tsuga, those are probably the best places to also put in yews that you're helping walk poleward. Now, what's important here for Europe to consider is Europe lost a lot of tree species because of poor geography when the climate turned the Pliocene and then the Pleistocene glaciations cooled. They just didn't have the kind of rivers draining south, the kind of north-south mountain ranges versus east-west mountain ranges, and of course the Mediterranean Sea. They lost genera, and they lost both their Tsuga and their Tsugas. So I'm beginning to wonder whether Taxus plicata, the wild European yew that has really diminished, whether the only real way to be able to move it somewhere and then have hands off is if you've already got genus Tsuga and Tsuga established as the canopy trees in those moist, wet, shady areas. That's how to rewild yews in Europe.
So that's the best I can offer for thinking like a yew. This puts an end to episode 3 of Helping Forests Walk. And as always, may the forest be with you.